Great. Okay, my name's David, and I'm the owner of Window Butler. It's managed by myself and our operations manager, Martin Kortson. And basically I decided to contact the citizen about an issue I'm having with Ontario's Ministry of Labour. And I think they're an organization that's got good intentions. They're established to serve a good purpose, and that's mostly to make sure that people are being treated fairly at work. In our case, that's been something we've focused on for about 4 years. It's been really central to how we thought we were going to succeed, and that was by finding the best people and making sure that they were really happy to work for us. Occasionally we make mistakes, and in one case, it brought about my interaction with the MOL, which is the Ministry of Labour. And that was with somebody named Pierre Charon, who had worked for us only briefly, about 2 months. He borrowed a truck from us one night. It was without permission. Took it, and it was in a small accident in a parking lot outside the LCBO, from which he left the scene and tried to cover it up by switching the license plates on the truck that he was driving with another truck in our fleet that was identical. Later on, the person he was in the accident with had called the police. There was an investigation around it. Eventually they had determined that he had switched the plates by comparing the VIN numbers with the license plate. He went to jail for this for about 45 days, and we let him go after we found out for sure that he had actually done this. Shortly thereafter, maybe a couple months after he was released, he'd filed a claim with the Ministry of Labour saying that we'd owed him about $1,200 in back wages and some other fees. And the really kind of unfortunate part about this that I thought was, I think it's great that he's got an outlet to do that in, but is the way that it was conducted. And mostly that you had a situation where you had somebody who was, criminally convicted in part for wronging, his employer, and evading police, other things that I imagine went into it. I really don't know, but what exactly the charges were. But I do know he went away for it for a bit. Who was able to actually get somebody convicted for a crime and put them in a position where they had to prove that they were innocent. Where on the flip side, he actually had in this case, it seems like, the luxury of being assumed innocent and then having to prove himself guilty. In our case, the MOL sends a letter first saying, we are assuming that, you've committed these, what they call it, contraventions of the act, but essentially have broken the law, unless you can prove otherwise. Now that, to me, says you're guilty until proven otherwise. That's something that, doesn't really fly in Canada. Normally you get the assumption that, hey, unless somebody can prove it, we're going to assume you haven't done it. We didn't get that. Nevertheless, we complied. We sent them all the documentation they were looking for, and the results showed that if anything, we had overpaid them by potentially $1,000. The reason for that is pretty simple. He had taken some days off that we paid him for, and we didn't dock him for him. And the reason for doing that, when we've got guys working for us, we're not heartless. We know that about how much they make. They're paid well with us, but they're not exactly the richest people on the planet. And we don't want to see somebody suffer for an entire pay period because, we know that they screwed up once. It's not something you really want to deal with. So generally we give guys a little bit of slack here and there. Regardless, at the end of everything, we had overpaid them by about $1,400. They came out and they said, well, look, can you give us about $300? And they didn't really give a great justification. Their math for it didn't add up. It was incorrect. And I disagreed with the reasoning. In fact, I think most people would. I declined. I said, I don't think this is fair. I think it's pretty clear. I gave you everything you asked for. And you can see that, if anything, we've overpaid him. My feeling is, as a result, the entire company was audited. And that actually came to, we got more indications that was actually what had happened, and the reason why it had happened was essentially we were being punished for disagreeing with them. And when the auditor came, and this really plays more into the theme of that, you can see, just this feeling that, hey, you're a criminal, and unless you can prove otherwise, we're going to not only convict you of a crime, but we're going to treat you like you're a criminal. And the auditor who came to our office was, especially terrible. The things she say are not things you would expect to hear from a government that is, primarily there to, its very first purpose, I would say, is, to make sure that everything is conducted justly, and it wasn't. when I asked her if why it seemed that when I questioned her on, why does it seem like I'm being punished for treating my employees, or being generous to my employees, and her response was, well, you know what? Nice guys don't always finish last, or nice guys often finish. Excuse me. Let me do that again, if you don't mind. But when I had asked her if why I was being punished for being generous to my employees, she said, "Well, you know what? A lot of the times, nice guys finish last," and she kind of smiled about it. There was another quote where I remember her saying, I'd asked her that, it doesn't explain basically that the situation didn't seem fair, that I was being treated like a criminal, although I hadn't done anything, and I had to prove that I was innocent, and otherwise they were going to assume that we had done terrible things. She looked at me and with a smile says, "Well, you know what? We don't care about what's fair. It's not in any of our documents. It's not in the law. All that I think the word fair comes out somewhere, maybe in our vision with air quotes, or a mission statement or something like that." And that was it. You figure, look these guys are supposed to be about fairness. That's what the Ministry of Labor is about, is making sure that, first off, labor isn't treated fairly, and then you'd figure that they'd reciprocate and there'd be somebody who'd be interested in making sure that their employers are as well. Because this isn't the 1800s, right? Like, there's not a big discrepancy between employees and employers. We're very close to being on the same page. Even on one of the first documents we received, it had said that on it, that, our goal is to make sure that, things are dealt with fairly for employers and employees. My experience was with them that just wasn't the case. You don't feel that they care about any sort of fairness. And then that was confirmed later on when she told me that directly. There was, at one point where I said to her, I was like, "Look, if you're going to treat me like a criminal and you're talking to me like that, it's a terrible feeling. I haven't done anything wrong, and frankly, it makes me wish that I could do something easier, maybe not be in business." And she says to me, at that point, she had this steel clipboard in her hand, raises it up, slams it on the table, and yells, "That's enough." And we were in my accountant's office at the time. And, she was visibly frightened, and even said so afterwards. Thought that this other woman, her quote was anyway, that "I was worried she was about to get physically violent. I thought she was about to jump across the table at you." I laughed. I said, "Really?" And she kind of looked back and said, "Yeah, like, I'm not joking." Oh yeah, I had asked her about when we were speaking about fairness. She said, "Well, there's always the appeal process." And I said to her, "Well," I'm like, it seems to me like the letter I got said, if you choose to appeal this, you're going to have to be dealing with somebody who's going to breathe fire and has fangs and all sorts of terrible things. Like, it doesn't make it seem like a viable or smart option." And she kind of smiled and said, "Well, you know what?" She's like, "Well, that's the idea." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She says, "Well, basically, we want to make sure that there's no escalation. Because if there's an escalation, then that means I can't be out here. I've got to be in there dealing with that sort of stuff. And they want me on the field. So our job is just to make sure that, it doesn't go any farther." That's funny. What happened to, that whole idea of, like, fairness or justice? So you're telling me that not only, do I have to prove that we've conducted ourselves well, beyond any, really, nearly a shadow of a doubt, without, with a, quote, judicial tribunal at best. Not that it was going to go there, but, I mean, that's just seemed to be the ultimate conclusion of it if you were to draw it out that far. And then, beyond that, their goal right away is to make sure that it doesn't get escalated in the first place. So you've got this strange situation where you're assumed to be guilty, you're not allowed to move things up if you have a complaint, or their job is to strongly discourage that from happening, and then you don't even get the same rights that everybody else would if you were to drag it on. And it's unfortunate. Yeah, so I just thought it was an interesting change of events to watch somebody who had wronged somebody, had been proven wrong, and then to be able to go and put somebody else in this situation with one phone call. It was unfortunate, but that's been my experience with them so far.